In the middle of the 18th century, along the eastern shores of North America, 13 British colonies stretched from Massachusetts to Georgia. People there worked the land, built towns, and dreamed of prosperity in what they called the New World. Yet the promise of freedom that had drawn them across the ocean began to fade under the weight of imperial control. The British Parliament and King George III imposed law after law, tax after tax, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Tea Act, demanding revenue from people who had no voice in the government that ruled them. Anger simmered in the taverns and churches of the colonies until it found expression in a simple, defiant phrase: no taxation without representation. By the 1770s, resentment had become resistance. Britain regarded its colonies as possessions meant to enrich the crown, not as partners in a shared destiny. Trade was restricted, soldiers occupied towns, and local assemblies were ignored. Ordinary farmers, artisans, and merchants realized that the freedom they had sought was slipping away beneath the same tyranny they had once fled. Networks of rebels began to form. Letters and pamphlets spread the message of liberty from colony to colony. People who had never met began to think of themselves as part of one cause. And in December 1773, that cause took dramatic form in the port of Boston. On a freezing winter night, 3 ships loaded with taxed British tea lay anchored in Boston Harbor. A band of colonists, faces painted in disguise, boarded the vessels and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the icy water. The harbor churned brown with rebellion. What became known as the Boston Tea Party shocked the empire and thrilled the colonies. To Britain, it was a criminal outrage. To Americans, it was the first open act of defiance. The Crown retaliated by closing the harbor and tightening its grip on Massachusetts. But instead of breaking colonial resolve, the punishment drew the colonies closer together. 13 separate outposts began to feel like one people. Tension soon erupted into war. On the morning of April 19, 1775, British troops marched toward the small towns of Lexington and Concord to seize hidden weapons and arrest rebel leaders. On a misty field at Lexington, a line of local militiamen waited, farmers and blacksmiths holding muskets more from conviction than training. No one knew who fired first, but the single crack of a gun echoed around the world as the shot heard round the world. With that sound, the American Revolutionary War had begun. There would be no turning back. While battles flared across New England, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia to decide their future. Could they still negotiate with Britain, or was independence the only path? Among them was a quiet Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, chosen to craft a statement that would explain to the world why the colonies must break away. On July 4, 1776, Jefferson's words were read aloud before the Continental Congress. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those lines were more than a declaration against a king. They were a declaration of faith in humanity itself. For the first time in history, a nation claimed that government existed to serve the people. With the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the United States of America was born, not yet in peace, but in purpose. Freedom, however, would not be won by ink and ideals alone. It would be earned in blood, hunger, and perseverance. The British Army was powerful and disciplined. The Continental forces were small, poorly trained, and often without pay. At their head stood George Washington, a man of few words and immense determination. Through every defeat and every retreat, Washington held his men together with calm resolve. During the winter of 1777-1778 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, the army faced starvation and disease. Snow covered the ground, supplies were gone, and many soldiers had no shoes. Yet they endured, driven by the belief that they were fighting not for a monarch but for the right to determine their own destiny. Fortune began to turn when France, inspired by the colonists' courage and eager to weaken its old rival, entered the war on America's side. French ships and troops joined the fight, and together with Washington's army they began to challenge Britain's dominance. The struggle culminated in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia, where British General Lord Cornwallis found himself surrounded by American and French forces. His surrender ended major fighting and signaled that the impossible had been achieved. A band of farmers and tradesmen had defeated one of the greatest empires in history. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the independence of the United States. After 8 years of hardship, the dream of liberty had become reality. The cost was immense. Towns destroyed, families broken, thousands dead. But in the ashes stood a new nation founded not on monarchy or privilege, but on the radical belief that all people possess certain natural rights. The United States was an experiment in democracy, untested and uncertain, yet filled with hope. George Washington, the man who could have made himself king, instead laid down his sword. In 1789 he became the first president, serving not for glory, but out of duty. His restraint set the tone for a government of laws rather than men. Across the Atlantic, Europe's monarchs watched in disbelief. How could a group of colonies overthrow an empire? The answer was simple. They fought not for conquest or riches, but for freedom. The American Revolution soon became more than a war for independence. It became an idea that would echo around the world. Revolutions in France, in Latin America, and later movements for democracy across continents drew inspiration from those early words of 1776. Yet the new nation was far from perfect. The promise of equality excluded many. Enslaved Africans remained in chains, and women were denied a voice. But the revolution had planted a seed of conscience that future generations would nurture. Each struggle that followed, the abolition of slavery, the fight for women's rights, the civil rights movement, traced its roots back to the ideals declared in Philadelphia. As the smoke of battle cleared and the American flag rose over a free land, a new chapter in human history began. The world had witnessed something extraordinary. Not merely the birth of a country, but the birth of an enduring idea. That idea, that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, continues to shape nations centuries later. Every 4th of July, when fireworks light the sky, Americans celebrate not only victory over Britain but the courage of ordinary people who chose liberty over fear. Freedom, they proved, is never given. It is earned, through courage, through sacrifice, through the conviction that ordinary people can change the course of history. The flames of freedom that were kindled in 1776 still burn today, not just in America but in the hearts of all who dream of justice and dignity. The story of America's birth is, at its core, the story of humanity's eternal struggle to be free. It began with voices of protest in crowded taverns and ended with the creation of a republic built on ideals that continue to challenge the world. Out of rebellion came a vision. Out of hardship came unity. And out of hope came a nation whose greatest power would always be the belief that liberty belongs to everyone. And so, more than 2 centuries later, the words still ring true. Freedom was not given, it was earned.